and we're good to go. I think I'll mute people, and then we'll unmute at the end if people have questions or want to discuss any of the sources, or I'll unmute, intermittently as we go. I'm breaking this down to sections, you'll see, so we'll have a chance to have some discussion. Okay. So this is the first in 3 classes that I'm going to give during the 3 weeks. We're now in the middle of the 3 weeks. The 3 weeks, of course, run from Shavasa B'Tammuz, the 17th of Tammuz, until Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. And the 17th of Tammuz is the day on which the walls of Jerusalem were breached by the Romans. And then there was 3 weeks of fighting after the walls of the city were breached until the 9th of Av, when the Beit HaMikdash, when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. It's understood that the Beit HaMikdash continued to burn actually all the way until about midday on the 10th of Av, which is why some of the restrictions of Tisha B'Av, like, or of the 9 days, which we're starting tonight, like not eating meat and wine, continue even after Tisha B'Av has ended. Just as a side note, from a halachic perspective this year, it's interesting, in a normal year, all of the restrictions of the 9 days, not eating meat and wine, not cutting your hair, not washing your clothes, all of those restrictions continue until midday on the 10th of Av. But when the 10th of Av is Erev Shabbos, as it is this year, you can get a haircut or wash your clothes or do everything like that from the morning from Friday morning. You still can't eat meat and wine. That has to wait until noon, but some of those restrictions are waived so that you have adequate time to prepare for Shabbos. In any case, so in these 3 classes, I'm going to be focusing on the way 3 very different 20th century Jewish thinkers thought about the meaning of Tisha B'Av specifically, and more generally, tragedy and evil, what the purpose was of evil in the world, and how we are supposed to relate to it. So tonight I'm going to begin with Eliezer Berkovits. Eliezer Berkovits is a fascinating thinker for many different reasons. He lived from 1908 to 1992. So he is one of these people whose lifespans covered most of the major events of the 20th century, if not all of them. Originally, he was educated in Germany. He had smicha from the Hildesheimer, what was known as the Hildesheimer Seminary in Berlin, sort of a bastion of, let's say, proto-modern Orthodox rabbinic education. And he had a PhD in philosophy from the University of Berlin. To get smicha from the Hildesheimer Yeshiva, or Hildesheimer Seminary, you needed to have a PhD. So everyone was a rabbi doctor in those days. And he wrote and published a tremendous amount of material. I think he probably published over 20 different volumes, beginning with his PhD dissertation in the 1930s, written in German. He came to, in 1939, he escaped Nazi Germany, right around just after, I think, Kristallnacht. And he was one of the leading students of Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, who's known as the Sidrei Eish. Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg is known as the Sidrei Eish because that means the remnants of the fire. And that book, that is the title of his collection of tshuvot, of halachic responsa, that Eliezer Berkovits carried with him out of Nazi Germany, smuggled them out when he moved to England, or when he escaped England in 1939. So Berkovits spent the war years in England, and then immediately after the war, he moved to Sydney and was the rabbi of a shul in Sydney, Australia, for some time before making his way to America, and was at the Skokie Yeshiva for most of his career. And then he made Aliyah in the late 70s. He passed away in Yerushalayim in 1992. And he was both he's known for 2 very different things. One is for his philosophic works. I think his book and we'll talk about it a lot tonight, God, Man, and History, it was written in 1959, it's probably still, I think, the best introduction to traditional Judaism. If someone said, give me a 200-page book that's fairly readable, that explains what Judaism is, I would give them God, Man, and History. So that's, and he was very much a defender of orthodoxy, of Orthodox belief, of traditional beliefs of Torah Sinai, of revelation, and at the same time that he was a defender of orthodoxy and traditional Judaism. He was also known for being a very creative and sort of progressive halachic thinker when it came to the issue of agunot, women who have trouble can't get divorced, and women's roles. And he actually got sort of into trouble later in his career with some of the more conservative traditional Orthodox authorities. He was involved in a dispute with Rav Soloveitchik, or he was on one side of the dispute that Rav Soloveitchik was on the other side, which might actually be part of the reason why I think Eliezer Berkovits is less well known or not as widely studied anymore. But there's been sort of a renewal of interest in his thought in the last 15 years or so, and a number of his books have come back into print just in the last 10 years. Okay, so let's dive into what the aspect that Berkovits published on a lot of different issues, and we're going to talk about how he related to the notion of evil in the world and Tisha B'Av specifically. So to understand, though, how Berkovits approaches these topics, I guess before I get started with this, I'll just unmute you for a second. And ask any questions about the biography. Okay, so let's dive in now to how Berkovits deals with the issues that are the topic for us tonight. To really understand that, we have to take a step back and understand what Berkovits thought one of Judaism's greatest insights was. What Judaism teaches and brings that he felt was truly unique, especially when compared to Christianity or thinkers, even philosophers who weren't necessarily Christian but came out of a Christian milieu. And for him, it is the way in which Judaism conceives of ethics. And Berkovits stresses that Judaism is interested in ethics, not in sort of an abstract sort of way, I know in an abstract sense what's right and wrong, but in its ability to teach people to do the right thing in any situation. He said that no matter how well you know what's right, it doesn't matter unless it leads you to do something which is right. So let's see what he says here. But one does not learn the art of self-control by merely reading the Bible. One learns it by actually controlling oneself in the face of a challenge. The educational significance of the inhibitive as well as the positively enjoying ritual laws is that they represent the indirect attack of Jewish intention on the essential self-centeredness of the biophysical element, the unwilling yet indispensable partner in the ethical life. So this is a big topic for Berkovits. He spends a lot of time discussing it. The purpose of what he broadly defines as the ritual laws, right? We have mitzvot that we are clearly ethical: don't steal, don't kill, don't charge interest. All of those types of mitzvot that are clearly ethical and about helping the other person. And then we have other mitzvot that are not about that. They're bein adam l'makom. They're about God, our service to God. So he says that those mitzvot also, though, are intrinsically about changing our bodies or about shaping our bodies. And one way in which they do that is that they are just about training us to think of something beyond ourselves. The laws of kashrut mean you can't eat everything. So we put ourselves in an artificial situation, he says, where you have to show restraint and you have to sort of consider someone or something else. You have to consider God in this situation. This trains you in a sort of indirect way to not just think about your needs at any given moment, but to think about the needs of others. That's one purpose of the ritual laws, he says. And then the other, though, is just as important. It's not just an indirect way in which we train our bodies. These laws are also there so that by obeying the command of God, the human organism itself becomes related to God. By doing the will of God, it is enabled to enter into a relationship with the divine. And so worship, Berkovits says, can never happen through the mind alone. Just the same way reading the Bible alone isn't going to make you a good person unless you're actually sort of practicing it with your body in some way. So too, thinking about God, even if you enunciate prayers with your lips, that's a little bit better, I think you would say. But unless your whole body is bound up in serving God, your worship is never really going to be complete. You're never totally going to become or develop a God-oriented persona, because we're not just a body. We're also we're not just a mind, rather. We're also a body, and these two things together are meant to worship God in unison. And that, he says, is the other point of the ritual mitzvot, that our worship of God has to have some sort of physical form to it. So, and this is the ethical deed or the religious deed that he is focused on. The deed, as we saw, is born of the union of body and mind. In the deed alone, may the two join together, complementing each other to mutual advantage. In fact, the deed is the stuff of which history is made. As the deed of the race, so its history, right? So we change the world not with our ideas, but with our physical actions. And you don't measure how great a people is by how great their abstract ideas are, but instead by what they actually have done in history. For the deed to be effective, it must not remain the act of an individual, but it must become that of a community. Right? So anything we do as individuals is sort of limited. Unless our deeds, if we really want to impact history, what we do has to be done more broadly by a group of people, by a community, by a nation. The deed makes history if it is the materialization of the desire or will of a community of people joined together in a common cause. Because the deed is to be effective in the external world of man, the community that it requires must be a living society in reasonable control of its general life. A people in control of its own life, capable of implementing Judaism by applying it to the whole of life, is a people in its own land. Judaism, as the religion of the deed, requires a people in its land. And so worship of God requires that we have that we're able to act in history. And just the same way as an individual, our worship is incomplete if we only do it with our minds and we don't do anything physical. So too, as a people, our worship of God is going to be incomplete unless we are able to really orient our whole society towards God. And that requires applying a place in which Judaism can be applied broadly, not just in the kitchen, to use an old phrase, but out in the street as well, and applied to all the questions of general society. For Berkovits felt very strongly that Judaism to live, to flourish, needed not just to deal with questions of kashrut, but also questions of war or healthcare. And that required the Jewish people to be in their own land. So I don't know if anyone has any questions. I think people can unmute themselves. Any questions?
What does it mean practically that you have to do Aliyah?
So Berkovits was a big Zionist. I think so. The answer to that is yes. I don't know that Berkovits felt that every individual Jew had to make Aliyah, even though he certainly did it in his life. But he did think that that Jewish life was best lived or most fully lived in the land of Israel, and that anywhere practicing Judaism outside the land of Israel was always going to outside Medinat Israel, the nation of Israel, was always going to lead to a sort of stunted sort of Judaism.
It's incomplete Judaism, that
yes.
in his opinion.
That's what he's saying. So obviously here we can sort of see already, and he hasn't said anything about evil or Tisha B'Av or exile, right, where he's going with this. Because if you're not in your own land, all of a sudden Judaism can't be lived out fully. You don't have a chance to act in history, and therefore you're not able to fulfill the ultimate purpose of the Torah. So let's look at this a little bit more in depth. So he addresses specifically the question of exile in a couple of different places. We'll start with God, Man, History, and then we'll move to some of his later essays. He says in God, Man, History, again, just important to keep in mind, it's written in 1959. Exile is not an accident, but the natural lot of the people of God. Jewish history is inseparable from world history. The intensity of the exile is the measure of the world's opposition to the aspirations of the God-centered people. This is a negative version of Jewish universalism. Israel is always homeless in this world, as God's purpose for man is in exile in history. The exile of Israel is one of the manifestations of the Galut HaShekhinah, right? We talk about, the Gemara tells us, and the Midrash tells us that the Shekhinah, God's presence, went into exile along with the Jewish people. The exile, he explains that as the exile of the divine presence from the affairs of men. So this is actually sort of remarkable, because what he's done here is he said, why was the Beit HaMikdash destroyed? Why did the Jewish people go into exile 2,000 years ago? Because the world wasn't ready for the message that the Jewish people were bringing to it, essentially. Because Judaism and the Jewish people couldn't, to have a Jewish state that didn't live up to the highest these aspirations, or wasn't able at least not to live them out, to aspire to them, it wouldn't make any sense. And that the world wasn't ready, the time wasn't ripe, so the Jewish people had to go into exile because the world wasn't ready for our message. And that we know that in the course of the 2,000 years that we experienced in exile, there were periods of more intense persecution and less intense. And that reflected, those ups and downs reflected how willing the world was to hear a message not of might and power and self-centeredness, but instead one of taking care of others, of thinking of others, of expansiveness. So that the reason for our exile, actually, according to Berkovits here, is not because of our sins, which is surprising because so much of the keynote we say on Tisha B'Av, and in fact throughout the year, right? Anytime we daven Musaf, we talk about we're in exile because of our sins. So he addresses that. It is true that in a mood of rigorous self-criticism, Israel uttered the words, "Because of our sins, we have been exiled from our land." This is indeed a valid statement when the Jewish people faces God. Facing the world, however, the truth has been formulated in the phrase, "For your sake," we're talking this, and when we say this, we're talking to God. "For your sake are we killed all day." From the very outset of its history, Israel knew that exile would be inseparable from loyalty to its God-oriented course. So Berkovits is saying that in a world that's dominated by might and power, in which there's no room for a nation to aspire to ethical action, that in that world there's no room actually for a Jewish state to exist. And it's sort of interesting, actually, if you think about what's going on might have been going on in the 1950s. This obviously, though, sort of reflects. He thinks by 1959 there's a state of Israel. He thinks that he's committed to the state of Israel. He believes in it deeply. He obviously thinks that in 1959 the world is ready to hear the message of the Jewish people. So I think we can assume that he sort of was a believer in thinking that there was room for this message in the 20th century, that nations didn't, and he wasn't sort of a cynic, and I don't think he's someone who, let's say, believed in like a real politics approach to foreign affairs, where pessimism and cynicism and sort of balance of power ideas rule. I think he thought that you really could have ideas about ethics and morals and foreign policy. I don't know if that makes him sort of a Jewish version of Woodrow Wilson or a neocon or something like that, but it's just interesting to keep in mind. And he addressed this question of exile in several other places in similar ways, but he explores it from different angles. So in 1943, and this is also striking, he gave this as a sermon, I think, in 1943. So we're talking in the midst of World War II, in the midst of the Holocaust. He was living in England at the time. Might and pomp, national honor and greatness, imperial majesty and power politics are conceived in guilt and maintained in guilt. For this reason, we see in exile no break in our history, but a very important phase in the realization of Judaism. It was not purposeless suffering, it was not purposeless suffering, but for the sake of an ideal. And the exile had a purpose that we had to wait until the time and the moment was right. And that moment, I think already by 1943, because already in the early 40s, in 1940, he's writing a lot about the importance of a Jewish state. I think by 1943, he feels like that moment is coming. So even in the midst of the darkness of World War II, he has a sort of optimism, I think, about the future. And at the end, we'll see perhaps what the source of his optimism about history is. And so why is it though so important to have a land? What does this mean in a concrete way? And what is the real tragedy of not having a homeland for him? So in the 1970s, Eliezer Berkovits, I mentioned, he was known for being sort of a very creative halachic thinker, very liberal halachic thinker. That was when he began to publish a lot of his works on agunot, about the role of women, and a number of other halachic works. And he addressed what he had hoped, what his hopes were for what would happen when there was a Jewish state again. So he writes in 1973 in an essay, "The land was the opportunity for Judaic realization. The Torah is not fully applicable outside the land of Israel. The consequences of exile are most serious. The non-application leads to a continuous frustration of the spirit. The book learning, which is never tested through the contesting claims of the live issues, withers. Judaism loses its creativity." And so when halacha deals only with certain areas, he says that the creativity that was really inherent in the system withers. And so to some extent, right, we see this. You can sort of tell which, right, there are certain tractates of the Mishnah that the Babylonian Talmud didn't discuss because they weren't applicable outside the land of Israel. Right, so that you actually see that there's sort of a physical withering maybe to Torah when certain ideas, when certain halachot don't apply or mitzvot don't apply in certain places, we lose that. But it's not just the actual the material that we lose that bothered him. In 1974, there was a controversy in Israel about in the 70s about changing the law of return, and there were issues more broadly in America also about issues in terms of that we still have to this day about recognizing conversions or not recognizing conversions done by other denominations. And he wrote that this, in terms of the purpose of Torah Shel Baal Peh, the purpose of the oral law, this means that the transformation of the oral law into a text was due to political history. And so the whole idea that the oral law was supposed to remain oral. And it's only because Et La'asot Hashem, there's a time to act where you have to act for God, that we say that Chazal wrote it down. And that only because they were worried that the oral tradition would be lost, that's why it was written down. But this was never done because that was the ideal. And the reason why the oral Torah was never supposed to be written down, Berkovits and others think, is because an oral tradition always remains more fluid and more creative than something that's written. It was part of the spiritual tragedy of the exile that what halacha, in its original vitality and wisdom, intend to protect us from has happened. In a sense, we have become Karaites, right? The Karaites were a medieval faction of Jews that argued that the Torah Shel Baal Peh wasn't real, wasn't true. They just used Torah Shebektav. They just used the written Torah. It's the price we've paid for the preservation of our identity and Jewish survival. So Berkovits is using pretty harsh language here. He thinks that the way we think about Torah and halacha has become so sort of stunted and fixed that we've become like Karaites in our approach to the oral Torah, that we're so scared to be creative or stray from the what we think is fixed in front of us. And this was this was an ongoing frustration for Berkovits throughout his life. If we want to talk more about Berkovits, we could. But in terms of Tisha B'Av, the tragedy of Tisha B'Av for Berkovits is twofold. First, a nation that doesn't have a homeland, or a nation that doesn't have a political power, military power, doesn't really act in history. And for that reason, the Jewish people, when we lose our homeland, when we lose what little autonomy we had left by the time the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, suddenly we're cut off from our main purpose of existence, which is to try as best we can to shape history and to influence other nations by demonstrating a commitment to our values, to ethics and morals and the teachings of the Torah by how we act, not just as individuals, but as a nation, confronting every different issue that nations confront. So that's the first tragedy. That is the first tragedy, or one of the major tragedies, is that we're not able to bring the lesson and the teachings to the world that God intended us to bring to the world, because we lose the power to act as a nation in history. That's sort of, let's say, the outward tragedy, because we can't influence the world the way we're supposed to. The more internal tragedy of Tisha B'Av for Berkovits is that when we lose our homeland, we lose, Berkovits thinks, some part of Torah. We lose the creative spirit of Torah. Torah becomes stunted. And that loss is actually, in some ways, a deeper problem, I think Berkovits would say, or Berkovits certainly felt by the end of his life. Because by 1959, by 1973, of course, we were able to act as a nation again on the historic stage. And I think Berkovits felt very proud about that. And certainly we've seen a revival of all sorts of different areas of discussion in Torah and Halacha that didn't exist for 2,000 years. Questions about halachic military ethics are a big area of discussion now that obviously for 2,000 years we didn't talk about. And that debate happens sometimes in regular newspapers in Israel based on halachic sources. And so in that way, perhaps, the fact that we make decisions about issues we never had to confront before, and then we can model those decisions model that discussion, model that struggle of how to live an ethical life as a nation confronted by all sorts of real world problems. That's something that now we're able to do. On the other hand, though, I think Berkovits felt like the fact that the oral tradition became so fixed in exile, Berkovits thought that really stunted its spontaneity and its creativity, and that even after the rebirth of the state of Israel, that vitality never came back in the way Berkovits thought it should have, and that was an issue, I think, that frustrated him, because he felt like that was something we lost as a result of Tisha B'Av that we have yet to regain. So given those two historic losses that have haunted the Jewish people for so long, in many ways continue to haunt us, why, according to Berkovits, does God allow evil to exist in the world? Well, I'll get to that in a moment. I'll just stop in case anyone has a question. Okay.
I'm sorry. I want only to remark that I'm very intrigued by the whole thing, really. But there is one point at the very beginning is really in big conflict with one of the tenants. That if you look at the prophets, none of them gave any indication that diaspora or the galut was anything but the result of our sins. So there was no other cause but for our sins, this sin or that sin. But there was no other idea. This is really, I agree, it's very intriguing idea, very interesting idea, but it's not in line with orthodoxy or with a belief or one of the tenets of Judaism from the prophets, coming out of the prophets' words, that it's a result of sin, not of any other reasons. There is no historical idea that the world was ready or not ready, that we were not ready to carry the duty because of our sin. This sin in the first temple, this sin in the second temple, and perhaps since while we were in the diaspora that we were not ready. But there were no prophets there, so God knows what the reason was there. But I wanted only to remark on it.
No, I think you're absolutely right. It caught my attention also. And I did not notice really him quoting, and usually he quotes Chazal and Tanakh pretty regularly to support his arguments. And it is interesting. I'm not sure why he feels so confident in that idea that it's because the world wasn't ready. Because I agree with you. It's not our traditional approach. It's now not found in Navi amongst the prophets. It's not found really in Chazal. I mean, we do sometimes sort of remind God in our tefillot about how much we've suffered in exile. But you're right. It seems like a sort of revolutionary idea or an unusual interpretation, to say the least. It's a good question. Maybe I'll see if I keep looking through his footnotes what I come up with. But I'm not sure why he feels. Why he feel that. I'm not sure what makes him feel so strongly, not just so strongly, but so confident in that understanding of exile. Okay, so why does exile happen? What is the reason that God allows evil to exist in the world? The other part, as a preface to this question, Berkovits is known for one other thing besides his sort of defense of traditional Judaism and his creative halachic works. He was also the first Orthodox thinker to deal, I think, in sort of a systematic way, or to write a book that tried to deal broadly with the religious challenge of the Shoah. So his book, which he's probably most famous for, is Faith After the Holocaust. And I think there was very little that I can think of actually written by any Jewish thinkers of any stripe that dealt specifically, book length, that dealt specifically with the religious challenge of the Holocaust until the 60s. And then in the 60s and the 70s, we start to get a number of books that were written about it. So Berkovits was the first Orthodox thinker, certainly in America, to do that. He wrote an important work called Faith After the Holocaust I believe it was published in 1973. We'll see a quote from it in a moment. But I think the basis for his approach in Faith After the Holocaust was already there in God, Man, and History. So let's start there. In the history of monotheistic religion, there have been many who, attempting to solve the problem of the existence of evil, denied the existence of evil altogether. Right? There are some thinkers, including some Jewish thinkers, who, when you ask them about evil, they'll say evil doesn't really exist. Evil is really either evil is just the absence of God, or evil is only evil from our perspective. But when we know something in the end, when we see the big picture, we'll realize the evil was never really there at all. So Berkovits rejects this approach sort of out of hand. I think he sees it sort of as slightly inhumane to say that, right? Because it implies that someone's suffering isn't real in some way, perhaps. So he says this was obviously not the view of Isaiah. So here he's quoting Navi. God is the source of all realities, also the creator of darkness and evil, right? So God creates good and evil. According to Judaism, however, there is no evil in the absolute sense. As with everything else that is part of creation, evil too has its source in the deed of the creator. It has, therefore, a positive function. So he also rejects this idea that that comes up sometimes amongst some medieval Jewish thinkers that sort of almost see evil. It's as having, it comes up more, I'd say, in other religions, let's say not so much in Jewish thinkers. It creeps in, sometimes you see an influence here or there. The idea that evil exists sort of on its own, as if there are two forces in the world, sort of a dualistic approach. So obviously he rejects that also. But he says that evil is created by God, and because evil is created by God, it's not that it doesn't exist, but it has to in some way also be part of God's plan. It is for this reason that Rabbi Akiva could explain whatever the merciful one does is for good. He did not mean to say that evil does not exist, but rather that it subserves a purpose that is good, because it is of God. In other words, there's evil, but no evil principle in the universe. So how does this serve God's purpose? I apologize for this long quote here, but we'll go through it. It also may be argued that imperfection is the source of freedom in the world. After all, the absolutely faultless is unfree. A perfect being in a perfect world would live forever and act in accordance with its inherent law from which no deviation would be conceivable. The element of imperfection, therefore, not only renders a system of values meaningful by positing its adversary, as it were, to challenge it, but by allowing for spontaneity and freedom. It also establishes the basis of all conscious behavior as an act of responsible choice. God, in creating the universe, has delegated a measure of responsibility for its own history to creation. We find ourselves not in a universe of puppets, but instead in a universe in which freedom makes the deed possible. No doubt, God took a risk with creation by granting it consciousness and free decision. Such freedom may be misused at any time. The universe is not necessarily all good, but thanks to the element of spontaneity in it, it is forever capable of improvement. So God had to create a world in which evil was possible. He had to allow evil to exist. One, so that we would know good. Okay, that idea I think is pretty widespread. But two, because if evil doesn't exist, freedom means nothing. And we don't really have any real sense of freedom or any real spontaneity or any real responsibility. And God wanted to create a world in which humans were responsible partners with him, in which they could really succeed and really fail. And because we can really fail, we also are always capable at any moment of really growing and of really improving. And that for that reason, there are moments when God must hide himself, right? If God is always there to make sure that evil doesn't occur, then we lose that responsibility. And that's what he says in his work in Faith After the Holocaust. That God, his approach to the Holocaust is rooted in a traditional notion of Hester Panim, that God hides his face. He says the hiding God is present, though man is unaware of him. He is present in his hiddenness. So God is always there, even when he conceals himself. Therefore, God can only hide in this world. But if this world were altogether radically profane, there would be no place in it for him to hide. He can only hide in history. Since history, and in fact, God must hide in history, according to Berkovits, because history is man's responsibility. One would, in fact, expect him to hide, to be silent, while man goes about his God-given task. So as much as possible, Berkovits thinks, God must hide in history, must conceal himself, to give man maximum responsibility. Responsibility requires freedom. That's freedom to do good or bad, freedom to succeed or fail. But God's convincing presence, if God always showed himself, it would undermine the freedom of human decision. God hides in human responsibility and human freedom. So all evil exists in the world, even tremendous evil, because Berkovits thinks it's necessary. It's the necessary space for us to function as free and responsible partners with God in creation. If human growth is to mean anything, then evil also has to be allowed space as well. We have to be given that space to both succeed and to fail. Of course, Berkovits thinks, I'm going to skip the next source because it's getting a little bit late. We'll finish with the last one. Of course, though, Berkovits also thinks that God does not hide himself endlessly. That there are sort of guardrails on this system. There are moments when God says, you people, mankind, humankind, you've strayed too far. and that God intervenes. God, he says, in endowing man with a measure of freedom, the source of all human folly and all human achievement, accepted responsibility for the final outcome. God alone, who determined the beginning, will determine the end. Having granted man the freedom to fail, God will not let him fail irrecoverably. The divine responsibility for creation is the guarantee that the purpose of man's formation of freedom and responsibility will not ultimately be thwarted. That is the root of the messianic faith. Right? So there are, at moments, God will intervene. God, Berkovits says, takes a chance. I think he means that as a metaphor. Obviously, God doesn't really take chances, but kaviyachol, that God takes a chance, and that looks to us like that the world is determined by fate, and that sort of there's happenstance and there's evil in this world. But there has to be that element of evil and happenstance and chance if we're going to have responsibility and the possibility of growth. But ultimately, there are moments when God says enough, and God intervenes in history. And for Berkovits, I think there are moments where the tragedy becomes so great and overwhelming. And I think this is part of how Berkovits understood the miracle of the creation of the state of Israel. There are moments that become so great and so overwhelming that God intervenes into history, and defends the weak and the oppressed, and ensures that there will be room for that the final outcome will go according to God's plan, and that ultimately we're convinced, we believe that as a tenet of faith. He says that's ultimately what our belief, our messianic faith is all about, that God ultimately, God both gives us the space to grow, but ultimately he ensures that we are also always moving in some ultimate way over the long arc of human history towards a more just and a more fair world. And I think that optimism that Berkovits reveals here is also part of the reason why, even in the midst of World War II in 1943, he could talk about a rebirth, the rebirth of a Jewish state, because no matter what, we believe both ultimately that God gives us room to grow, and also that God will push us always along the right path, and that even as much as evil is real in the world and suffering is real in the world, ultimately we're moving along this positive arc. I'm going to leave it there. This was just an introduction to some key ideas in Eliezer Berkovitz's thought, but I think will hopefully help us prepare for Tisha B'Av, which now is just 9 days away. And I'll take questions if anyone has them.
I wanted to remark also that if you follow his thinking, the idea of free choice is really the basis itself for the bad, because if you choose the right way, then you don't have the outcome of the bad. So it's a human being that uses free choice in the wrong sense, so doesn't follow the free choice rightly, that creates it even.
Yes, right. Evil, really, for Berkovits, is a creation.
It's an outcome of the free choice itself.
Yes, right. Absolutely.
Choosing the wrong way. The other thing that I'm a little bit, I don't know, I'm personally, every time I hear about the messianic time and all that, I'm a little bit worried, because I remember all the messianic ideas in Judaism in the history, and the outcome, the horrible outcome we had each time with them. And we should believe perhaps a good outcome, but we should be very wary and careful when we put this messianic time, to put it in our time or in any time. I don't know. It led the Jewish people to very bad decisions in the past, with very bad outcomes.
No,
from Bar Kokhba and Shabtai Tzvi, and we don't need to go into all that. But
But you touch on an interesting point. Two things I want to say in response to that. One is that Eliezer Berkovits writes very confidently, which is in his approach to philosophy or halacha, or his opinions about the meaning of the state of Israel, and he exudes a confidence in his and a certainty in his way. And I think he was very confident that we were moving towards a messianic time, not necessarily in sort of the way Rav thought, in a mystical sense, but in the idea that Israel would be a powerful force for good in the world. Israel is a powerful force for good in the world, and that it would lead mankind towards a bad. And this Berkovits is the first thinker we're going to cover. Next week we'll talk about Rav Soloveitchik and the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and we'll see. Obviously, the Lubavitcher Rebbe also talked a lot about his messianic faith, and really was very confident about that Mashiach's coming was imminent. We'll see that Rav Soloveitchik, though, was Jacob a little more like you, but a little bit more skeptical, let's say. Not skeptical, but cautious, probably a better word.
You know, it's interesting because the British people, the British leaders who supported Zionism after the First World War and the Balfour Declaration, all that, the background of all the activity was a belief that if the Jewish people will come back and the Jewish people state will be established, there will be some, it will lead the world into some time of messianic changes and then improvement and all that. So I don't know, it's not only that he had that idea, even Christian had that idea at that time, after the First World War.
I think a lot of thinkers have had messianic ideas connected to Israel.
Yeah.
Any other comments?
Rabbi Levitt?
Yes.
I'd like to know could you just go over very quickly about the haircuts? I didn't understand that. You're not permitted to, would you explain it, please, real quick?
So you are not, you're not permitted, Ashkenazim don't get haircuts for the entirety of the 3 weeks.
Okay.
And so now we're going into the 9 days, and the 9 days, or the 3 weeks we normally think of as ending on Tisha B'Av, when the fast ends, which will be next Thursday, a week from Thursday night.
Okay.
But some of the restrictions carry over until noon on the 10th of Av. So it would be until midday the day after Tisha B'Av. And I was saying that the restrictions on, they're all not getting haircuts, not shaving, we don't do laundry during the 9 days. So all those restrictions normally carry over until noon on the day, or midday, until the day after Tisha B'Av. When Shabbos falls out, when the day after Tisha B'Av is Erev Shabbos, you can do those things in the morning, haircut, shave, laundry, because because we want to make sure that people have time to prepare for Shabbos properly.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so I think if there aren't any other questions, we'll call the night here. Tomorrow, 12:30, I'll be giving my Parsha shir. And then Thursday night, we'll have our recipes and social program. Monday night, I know we're going to have the book club. And then next Tuesday night, we will be discussing Rav Soloveitchik's views of Tisha B'Av and tragedy. So it was good to see everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.